All right, little change in the agenda here. We're going to bring in, we're going to do our tree stand safety. Mine's on. Turn your mics on, guys. Turn your mic.
Hey, good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I think it's only Commissioner Mitchell. I am Andy Huser. I run the Hunter Education Program for the Game Commission.
Can you start over? I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. Good morning. Andy Huser. I run the Hunter Education Program for the Game Commission. We've had some discussions internally quite a bit about tree stand safety, some of the injury rates of tree stands that we're encountering now, and potentially what our role might be in addressing those. But one of the biggest things is that we really don't know how bad the issue is. So I've brought in today Dr. Joseph Smith. He works in the intensive care unit at Geisinger Medical Center. He was one of the original authors of a study, the only study of its kind, which addressed this issue in Pennsylvania. So it's pretty safe to say that he's probably one of the foremost experts on the subject in our state. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Smith.
I'd like to thank the Game Commission and particularly Mr. Huser for inviting me to be with you today to share with you the results of some ongoing studies that we have on trying to get an estimate of the tree stand safety, or the injuries related to tree stand, falling from tree stands in Pennsylvania. I would like to point out that I'm not the only one involved. There is Dr. Hess from Penn State Hershey, Dr. Craig Wood from Geisinger, and Dr. Lindrich from Public Health Sciences at Penn State Medical School in Hershey. I would like to disclose to you folks that I have received, nor any of my colleagues working on this, we have not received any financial support to do this research. We represent ourselves. We do not represent the official opinion of either Penn State or Geisinger. The study that I'm going to show you, the results, this study was approved by the Institutional Research Board of Geisinger Health System. It was approved as an exempted study, and I'll explain what that is. And again, we claim, the authors claim responsibility for the analysis, interpretation, and conclusions. Our objectives were to understand the characteristics and estimate the rate and trends of falls from tree stands while hunting deer in Pennsylvania. Before I do that, though, I would like to acknowledge in the past I have worked with Jim Filkowski. He was here in the Hunter Safety Program when I first became involved with the Game Commission many years ago. Then Keith Snyder, Dr. Rosenberry over the years have been helpful. Bob Boyd has been very helpful, and Mr. Huser for inviting me here today. I would say to you folks on the commission that all these individuals have been very professional and very helpful in helping with this research. I would also like to acknowledge Nathan McWilliams from the Pennsylvania Trauma Systems Foundation for his help with this project. We started out back with this, we were interested in the shooting accidents. And this paper here, we published this paper back in the Journal of Trauma, Injury, and Infection and Critical Care Medicine back in 2005. We reported the results of investigating, or our study of 1,345 shooting incidents while hunting in Pennsylvania from 87 to 99. Of those 1,345, 415 were deer hunting accidents. Since we had much of the denominator data for calculating rates, we then asked, well, what's going on with injuries due to tree stands or falling from tree stands while hunting deer in Pennsylvania? And when I first received this invitation about a year ago, my intent was to just review the results of that study, which we identified 499 victims of tree stand falls. But since that time, for various reasons, I haven't been able to be here. Today I'm here. We've updated this, and I will present to you the results of the update from 1987 through 2015. The data for 2016 is not yet available from the Pennsylvania Trauma System Foundation. Now, unlike hunting-related shooting incidents in Pennsylvania, the Game Commission does not investigate nor have a database of these injuries or accidents. The Game Commission does conduct an annual game take survey, and from that surveys and the hunting license sales, you can get a number of deer hunters and hunting days. From the published proclamations, we looked at to get the actual days for hunting seasons and the regulations so that we could match them so that when we identified what we thought was a victim of a fall to an actual hunting day. From the Pennsylvania Trauma System Foundation, since there was no database of injuries, we turned then to the Pennsylvania Trauma Systems Foundation, and they have a database of all injured victims of any traumatic injury from way back in the 80s from all accredited trauma centers in Pennsylvania. Now, this information is derived from, it's abstracted from the medical records of the actual hospitalizations for the victims of trauma, of any traumatic injury. We searched this database and looked for the word tree stand. And from that, then the Trauma System Foundation provided us a line listing, or what I'm going to call our working database, for victims of falls from tree stands. Now, this information came to me in what I'm going to call a de-identified form. That is, I do not know the identity of the fall victims. And because it's de-identified, that is why this was an exempt study from the Institutional Research Board. What I'm trying to say is, for example, if one of you fell out of a tree stand, I would have no way of identifying you as the victim. I would have an individual of a certain age, a certain gender, who fell out of a tree stand on a certain day. And then the information that is available to me is what is in that medical record, that abstracted from the medical record. So if the information is not there, it's not in the medical record. So the only information that I have is what is in the medical record. Now, we had to come up with a definition of what was a fall victim. And for our purposes of our study, we said a fall victim was somebody who fell from a tree stand on a legal hunting day or a day preceding a legal hunting day. We tried to bring this down as close as possible to the hunting experiences as we could. And up until I think it was 2006, legal hunting age in Pennsylvania was somebody 12 or greater. In 2006, you then introduced the mentored hunting program, so it could be basically any age group. So we adjusted our database, our search for that criteria. From the database, we then selected variables that we were interested in to study. And then what we did to calculate our rates, we took the yearly number of falls that we identified from the Pennsylvania Trauma System Foundation, divided that by the yearly number of licensed hunted or hunting days as provided from the Game Commission. And then we standardized that number to either per 100,000 hunting license sold or licensed hunters or a million hunting days. Now, what I would like to tell you is in our database that we worked with from 1987 to 2015, according to our definition, we identified 1,109 victims of falls from tree stands while hunting deer. Now, if we were to expand our definition and say, instead of just the day preceding a legal hunting day, and expand it back to, say, the 1st of September of every year to the end of February every year, that is licensed hunting year, we would expand this number by another 162 victims. So we would have basically over 1,200 people that have fallen out of tree stands. Those are the ones that sought medical care at an accredited trauma center. We don't have any estimate of those who fell and did not receive care at an accredited trauma center. The mean age of the victims was 47. The gender, majority males. Now everybody's interested in the alcohol level of these people. Of those that we had data on, we didn't have data on 372. 46 of these were legally inebriated when they had their accident. Of those information that we had a drug test on, of the 285 that we had a drug test on, 40 of them, or 14%, were positive. And as you can see down here, the majority of those victims were positive for marijuana, tested positive for marijuana. Now, the season, 818 of this number occurred during the archery or muzzleloader or extended or early or extended rifle. Now, the reason why they're grouped this way, we had no way of knowing whether in October and in late January when the late muzzleloader season starts, or in October where you have the early October muzzleloader or the early rifle season or the extended rifle season, all I can tell you is that that is a day in which the victim fell out of a tree stand. I can't tell you whether they were archery hunting or muzzleloader hunting or participating in one of these extended or early rifle seasons. If they occurred during one of the published hunting dates that corresponded to the general hunting season, that's how they were assigned. You need to understand down here, though, that 82% of these occurred on a day that was strictly that we could identify as an archery hunting day. Now, the time of falls that pretty much evenly divided, except the groups here. We had them before 11 o'clock, between 11 and 3, and then greater than 3. Now, somebody may object to the inclusion of Sunday here, but that was part of our definition. The day preceding the legal hunting day, the rifle season opens on a Monday. Sunday is a day that precedes that. And you can see the majority of the people fell on Monday or on a Saturday. The cause, now again, I just want to go back. If the information is not available in the medical record, then we do not have access to that information. But so you can see that we have quite a bit of missing data on these three variables that we were interested in. However, of the ones that we did have information on, structural failure seemed to be the major cause. That is, the stand collapsed, fell out of the tree, or something happened. Majority of the people were in the stand when it occurred, when the accident occurred. They fell out of the stand. And there were other times when they were either entering or exiting or installing or taking down. I just want to go back and emphasize that there were 8 of these victims that were shot and then fell. Some of them hit by a stray shot, some in line of fire. And again, you're highly encouraged to wear a harness when you're there. Unfortunately, we have a lot of missing data, and we could only identify 19 or 7% of the victims of those of which we had information on actually wore a harness. I tend to believe that this is really underestimated. Now, in trauma care, in injury care, there is this thing we call the golden hour. That is, if you get somebody from a serious injury to medical care, within that hour, their chances of having a better outcome is better. And as you can see, that there's only 7% that make it to a medical center within that hour. There's 50% that make it within 3 hours, and some of them don't make it there for quite a long time period. Of those that were seen in the emergency room of one of these accredited trauma centers, you can see where some of them were admitted where they went from the emergency rooms. This is a scoring system that tells you how severely injured somebody is. A score greater than 15 is considered a major or polytrauma, and we had 29% of the 1,100 victims that were considered that. This Glasgow coma score is a way of measuring how severe the head injury, the brain injury is. 3 being bad, 15 being good. We had 20 or 2% that really had very severe head injuries. Now, if we look at the hospital stays, there were only 5 that were discharged from an emergency room to go home. This number, 99%, or virtually everybody, was admitted to the hospital. The mean length of the hospital stay was 1.6 days, but the range was from 0 to 142. There were 31% of the victims that needed to be in an intensive care unit. The average length of stay in an intensive care unit for those victims was 6 days, with a range of 0 to 142. And I can tell you, you can only imagine what this person's bill was. Now, the discharge status of these individuals, we had 99% that survived. 1% died of those that made it to the hospital. We have no clue how many died at the scene. If they're not seen in an emergency room or at a trauma center, we have no way of knowing what this number really is. But I want you to focus here, though, even though the case fatality ratio may be low, these people do end up with quite severe impairments: locomotion, transfers, feeding, emotion. So 24% of these fall victims did end up with some long-term disability. Now, here's the next slide, and here's some of the injuries, and I apologize, it's hard to see, but we had some that only received a single injury, some that had multiple injuries, but if you look over here, we have a percentage that had head injuries. Here are the spine injuries right here. Here are the torso injuries. Here are the orthopedic injuries. And the majority, the major cause, the major injury that these people suffered was soft tissue, that is, a deep laceration, contusions, hematoma, bruises, etc. Here's what you're interested in, though. Here is what the trend in the fall rate per 100,000 licensed hunter is. We start out very low in 87, and we're up here in 2015, and that's a little over 10, almost 11. In 1999 is when the hunter tree stand module was introduced to the hunter trapper safety education program. And since that time, the trend is really upward. Now, just so you get some idea for comparison, I just want to show you what's happened. This is the fall from tree stands. This is the shooting accidents that occur in deer hunting. You've had great success in reducing these accidents. There needs to be some more work done here. Now, if we can get an idea of when these accidents are occurring, what's driving these, we then looked at the 100 days from 90 to 2015. Again, I cannot separate out the archery from the muzzleloader, from the early and extended rifle, but here is the trend for all of the accidents, that gray line there. Here's the trend for the rifle season accidents. Here's the trend for the archery, muzzleloader, the earlier and extended rifle. These are what's driving this right there. It's the majority of the accidents right here. The age group of the hunters, it's the older hunters, it's not the younger hunters that are tumbling out. These are licensed falls per 100,000 licensed hunters in various age groups. Now, whenever you do a study like this, there's some limitations, and I'm going to tell you what they are. The victims, were the victims in the numerator of the race, were they all hunters? I believe the majority of them were. There may be some that were included that were not. Somebody might say, well, you have more trauma centers since 80s. That is true. However, the average number of victims that have fallen per trauma center has also increased. Back in 87 it was 0.25. In 2015 it's 2.5 victims on the average per trauma center. We do not know how many died at the scene, and as I pointed out to you, there's lots of missing data that we just don't have access to any way to acquire that data. Now, from what I can say, though, is I think that what I've shown you is the best estimate of what the problem in Pennsylvania currently is. I believe the problem to be increasing, and it's an increasing cause of severe hunting injuries. It's a bigger problem than the shooting incidents. Older hunters and hunters during primitive, and I put primitive in parentheses because some of these new crossbows and compound bows and muzzle loaders, they're not primitive weapons anymore. But the take-home message from this is, I've given you what I think is the best estimate. We really don't know what the full extent of the problem is, and I think you need better information. You need some active surveillance and investigation of the falls. Now, how does Pennsylvania stand up with other studies in this regard? Here's a study that was published in the same journal that we published our shooting incidents study in. And this is taken data from the Consumer Product Safety Administration, and then they matched that up with the number of hunters from the surveys from the United States Fisheries and Wildlife Surveys to come up with some numbers. But I just want to show you the trend. What they have just from 2000, they say there's no increase, unlike Pennsylvania. And likewise from an area in Wisconsin serviced by the Marshfield Medical Clinic there, they again show no increasing trend, whereas in Pennsylvania we do. But the take-home message is, regardless of whether there's an increasing trend or a constant trend, these accidents are very serious accidents. They may not be fatal, but they certainly cause a lot of chronic, long-term disabling injuries that people have to deal with. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Again, this is the best estimate that's available for Pennsylvania. I thank you for inviting me to share this with you today. There's lots of hours into this work, as you might anticipate, just going through the databases and looking at 1,100 victims and picking out and putting it in a form that's understandable. I hope this has been helpful to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I was told that if I push this button, the screen goes blank, and obviously it's not true. Any questions?
No, we certainly know that we have an issue with tree stand safety. There was some studies, I guess some things going around this summer being put on to show people, to teach people what what's occurring in tree stand. We have seen a change in our usage of our seasons, so that we're seeing more people hunt during archery. Of course, they typically hunt more out of tree stands. So it is an issue, and one that has touched myself as well. So I appreciate you coming in and giving us that information.
Well, I can tell you that I personally had the experience of having two of these problems. One is step break, and grateful that I was a hold of something when that happened. And then a year or so ago, I missed the bottom step. It's when you're there in the woods, it's a lonesome feeling.
It very much is, and I don't hunt by myself anymore for that reason.
Well,
we did after some of our hunters got the opportunity to see the seminars this summer, put on lifelines actually on all of our tree stands. We have about 60 tree stands out there, and we actually put lifelines up, which we've never utilized in the past. So thank you very much. Anything from the other commissioners?
I would like to say I've been an orthopedic surgeon in York, Pennsylvania for 37 years, and I can tell you that your study was very interesting. And of course, from a trauma center perspective, I worked at 2 hospitals in York. One was a non-trauma hospital. I can tell you that just in my practice alone, I was only one of 15 orthopedic surgeons in York, that each year, almost without exception, I would see anywhere from 2 to 5, 6 tree stand injuries. And I did not see the people that were paralyzed because obviously they went to the trauma centers and things, but I can tell you I saw fractured calcaneal heel bones, wrists, pelvic fractures, you name it, a lot of soft tissue injuries. But just to give you an idea of the number that you did not capture from your trauma study. But thank you for an excellent study. That was great.
If I could real quick, I would just add to that. I think what some of the research he indicated highlighted the problem we have, and that is our older licensed buyers where it's happening for the most part. And we see if we look at our sales, that's the area where archery is really increasing. They have more time of field, some of them are retired, they're getting into archery with the crossbows, and that's where the problem is happening with tree stand safety. And the difficulty that we have from an education standpoint is we can't reach them because, you know, for some of them it's been 40, 50 years since they took the hunter trapper education course. And it includes, and it has since 1990, a section on tree stand safety. But if they aren't required to go through that course again, which of course they're not, you know, for our older hunters, they're not aware perhaps of the safety issues with tree stands, and that's why we're seeing this problem. And that's the difficulty that we have if we're going to move forward with correcting it without making some changes moving forward.
So what would be the suggestion to move forward to correct that? How do we get that information out to the people that aren't using harnesses or safety belts? Or can we legally require them to use them in tree stands?
Legally, we certainly could if that's something that the board wanted to do. I'm not making that recommendation. I'm just saying an analogy would be you need a seatbelt when you drive. So legally, that's probably on the extreme. There could be a requirement that if you're going to be hunting from an elevated platform, you need a harness. There's been other discussions as well.
Well, I think the first step that we really need to look at before we look at addressing the issue, we don't fully understand the issue is the main problem right now. So, you know, perhaps mandated reporting of these incidents to the Game Commission is probably the first step that we should take. You know, that's something we could look at potentially, but yeah, I mean, we really don't have any grasp of, I mean, at best, this is a very, very conservative estimate of the actual number of falls that are out there. And as Dr. Smith said, we have very limited data on what the actual cause was. You know, it said in here there the number one cause was equipment failure. Other studies have identified that is certainly not the case. I mean, if that is only data collected from the victim, yes, I'm going to tell you that my stand broke when I fell out of it because I'm going to blame the manufacturer.
Sure.
So, you know, because they're not investigated, because we really don't know, and they're not reported, I think that would be our first step to address the issue. As far as what Steve said regarding mandatory harness use, there is one state that does require that. That would be Alabama. They require it only on their wildlife management properties, but I'm not sure that they have data to demonstrate whether or not that has increased or decreased the rate, just because it is such small areas that they require the use of the harnesses on.
So then the first step is mandatory reporting. So then, and I think we're probably going to get the same from all the commissioners, that we're okay with that. That, you know, mandatory reporting of injuries is something that should be occurring so that we can get the data that may lead us to a decision later on.
Right.
So, I mean.
And also, I think you have ladder stands, you have climbers, you have stands that people build. I mean, there's a big difference here. I mean, you build a wooden stand on private property, you fall from it, maybe because it wasn't maintained, the wood rotted. Climbers, you know, you can slip a climber easy.
Sure.
I mean, you know, you'd have to specify where the falls came from also.
Right. Where do we go from here?
Well, mandatory reporting is probably going to require legislation.
Okay. Yes. See, and that was a question that I didn't know if we had the power to do that. Maybe we should contact our legislators and get them to start working on something to require mandatory reporting of falls.
Yeah, we're now in the minority of states that don't report on their yearly HRSI statistics, that don't report tree stand falls. More states come on board every year. New York is just coming on board this year because they've had some serious issues up there with that.
Okay.
But it seems to me like the data should already be out there if you're saying that all these other states have been doing this for a while. So why do we have to get more data? Why can't we start trying to make, I have a proposal, you know, that we consider mandatory harnesses and mandatory climbing devices to help and you know, start trying to ease that in, say, you know, let people know that in a year or 2 years we're going to be mandating this type of equipment, at least on the lands that we can mandate it on the Pennsylvania Game Commission lands. And then hopefully the DCNR would follow suit, and then hopefully the legislation would follow suit. But why do we have to, you know, push just a back burner? I mean, this is a huge issue.
I don't think we need to. We were just looking at providing the board with more information so that you're comfortable making that decision. But
well, that information's already out there. I mean, maybe not in Pennsylvania, but I think if the literature search was done, it would be, it's there.
If anything, the search would show that it is worse in Pennsylvania than it is in other places. Yeah.
Therefore, the need to go a little more quickly.
We don't need legislative approval to do that, though, right? On our game land.
Right, do it as game lands, right? Right.
On the game land required.
So I don't know if you can jump ahead to that proposal now, or
I see a reason why not, because it's pertinent to this
Obviously,
issue. Yeah.
We'll draft regulations from the commission.
you know, and just ease in. And this year in the digest, we get it out there that, hey, following year we're going to be doing this, and get some education tools for the older hunter. I got to tell you that, you know, people I hunt with, the younger people all had the harnesses, and it was the older people that, you know, didn't have the harnesses. So some, you know, ease in some education and draft some rules how it's going to be implemented, and you know, I can't see how any reasonable hunter would be opposed to that, or any legislator, how they could possibly be opposed to it, really.
Well, I think the key to it is that we need to get the word out there that there is an issue, because if they're saying they were forcing them to spend $100 for a harness and there's no issue, there's going to be pushback. But if we say, well, there is an issue and we've got numerous people being injured every year, and that's where the data collection comes in as to whether to be able to back that up, and I think we can. Like you said, there's got to be information out there from other states as well.
And the harness issue, though, I don't think it's going to be an expense. If you buy a tree stand, you get the harness with it.
Typically, you get a harness that you need an engineering degree to put on.
Well, I'm not arguing with you there.
But there's some commercially available, easy to put on. Otherwise,
I bought the vest.
I need to put it on the day before just so I can figure it out.
But even these climbing devices, where they, you know,
The lifelines.
Yeah, the lifelines. That was new this year.
Yeah,
That was
really
something we hadn't used, and we have had hunters fall coming out of tree stands and get injured. And I mean, it's, you know, it's dangerous either way. But you know, it's a fact of life today that we're up in the trees. So we've got to do something about it.
Is there any way that could be highlighted in the game news?
absolutely, yeah.
Well, and the annual digest that comes out, the hunting digest too, big article about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for inviting me.
Absolutely.
Brian, did you want to talk about the digest now or go back to the regular agenda?
We'll go back to regular agenda.
Okay.
But I think that's what, well, wait, you're up here anyway, might as well.
Go ahead.
Yeah, if Brian, do you mind, since he's up here? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then moving forward with the agenda for I&E, I was informed that the board wanted to discuss the Hunter Trapper Digest for next year. Just by way of background, since I know we have two new members of the board, last year we were asked, as we typically are, to look at ways that we could cut costs from the operational level, knowing that there was potentially not going to get a license increase for this year. One area that we looked at was the issuance of a free digest to everyone who buys a hunting license. We were anticipating an expenditure there of roughly $250,000 to print and mail over 1 million digests to all of our issuing agents for everyone who buys a hunting license. We did a quick survey of our surrounding states to see where they were at with digest, and we found we were the only state that continued to provide a free digest to all licensed buyers. Most states had moved away from doing so, or actually all states had moved away from doing so, just in different forms. Some made it available upon request for purchase. Some were providing it free of charge to seniors, but no state was continuing to give it to everyone who bought a hunting license free of charge. Based on that information, we developed a pocket guide that contained all the relevant info that an individual would need to know at any moment regarding hunting and trapping seasons. An individual could pick this up at any time and see what's in season, how much plus and orange was required to hunt it, and the shooting hours for that day. In addition, it provided the contact info for all of the regional offices, as well as the link to where they could find the full digest online. And we did this in conjunction with Commissioner Daly, relying on his expertise as a hunter-trapper instructor regarding what individuals need to know at any moment. You know, anytime you do something new, obviously there's a lot of concerns moving forward with it. The biggest concern that we had was whether or not there'd be an impact from the law enforcement standpoint. Would it impact the ability to move forward with prosecutions, the fact that an individual wasn't given a full digest? We don't know for sure how that will play out because there still obviously are a lot of prosecutions going through the court system. But as of today, we can say that we haven't heard any instances in which it was a negative impact for an officer to bring charges against an individual. That was obviously our biggest concern, and should that information change, that will certainly impact our decision moving forward in what we do. But currently, as of today, we haven't heard any instances in which it became a problem. From the social standpoint, the reception was mixed. This was either the worst idea we've ever done and it was going to result in lawlessness, or it was the best idea we've ever done and it's about time we looked at a way to cut cost. It seemed, based on the calls I took and the emails we received, that the perception was on one of those extremes for the most part. One problem we did have when an individual will call in and say, you know, I don't know what's in season, is we found a lot of problems in which they weren't getting the pocket guide from the issuing agent. I can think of at least a half dozen instances in which an individual said, I have no idea what I'm supposed to be hunting, blah, blah, blah. I said, well, did you refer to your pocket guide? The line would go quiet. What pocket guide? It turned out they never got one from their issuing agent. And whenever we received those complaints, we would certainly follow up and mail them a free one as well. And you know, for the most part, then we never heard back. So I assume that their concerns were taken care of. From a number standpoint, what we can say, what we do know is that we sold roughly 865,000 hunting licenses this past year, and only 65,000 individuals went ahead and purchased a digest, which we made available for the cost of $6. So roughly 93% of our hunters did not feel that a digest was worth buying a full digest. Of those 65,000 who did, we derived the revenue from that in the amount of $327,000. You know, to give you a full picture, that number doesn't include how much that we spent mailing the digest, because we handled the fulfillment here at our warehouse. And I believe the Bureau of Administration would have those numbers as far as the postage and man hours that went into it. But we do know just from revenue, what we were looking at was roughly $325,000. And we saved an expenditure of, as I indicated before, about $250,000 by not printing the full complement of the million or so digests. One positive that we derived from this that we didn't anticipate was, if you look at the timing, the full digest is typically printed in April and has always then been distributed, and then it's set based on how the regulations looked at in April. And there were a couple instances this year in which the regulations changed, and by driving people to the website, they were able to see the digest that had been updated in real time. For instance, with the electronic decoys that just went into effect, we were able to instantly make those changes online. So anybody who had bought the digest, and that's always a problem when you buy the hard copies, is you're not going to see the updates. But by pushing them to the website, they can see any changes as they're being made. I think we always knew that this was going to be a trial basis, and we were going to see how it was received and make adjustments if needed to moving forward. But that's where we are now. That's what we're looking at. I don't know if it's the sense of the board if they want to continue in this direction or look at different options or what. So that's where we are.
I saw a lot of numbers being thrown around, and I'm not sure exactly which numbers were real, but what does it actually cost us to make a digest? per copy?
Well, it depends on it, because the printer that we work with, if you buy bulk, like we do, if you do 1 million, we were looking at about 250,000. Now, they make their adjustments based on how many that we're printing. So, for each individual copy, the answer on how much it costs depends on how much your entire order was.
So what's your best guess?
On that
$2,
one
$2.50
sheet I provided, no, it's
Less than that?
19 cents, I think.
25 cents, something
Yeah.
like that.
That would, in that ballpark, if you're doing an order of 1 million.
Bring a
yeah.
million copies.
Right. So my take on the digest, I think it's great that we have the internet and everything, but my take on this digest is that this is one way that the Pennsylvania Game Commission can get what we want to our hunters as far as education. Okay, we're talking about tree stands. One of the things I'd like to see is, a big page on endowments to the Game Commission in there every year, and just general education about what's going on, what we're thinking. I mean, this is our way to communicate it. I don't think many people are going to go to the website just to read about what the Game Commission is doing. I think this is our one. I mean, yes, we have the game news, and we can sort of use that too. But I think this is one thing where we can hit every hunter and give them some really valuable information. I think the little slip, I thought it was great. It had all the times on and the dates, and I thought that was perfect. But to me, this is an educational tool at a relative, and I know there's a lot of concern about cost, but at a relatively inexpensive cost to the Game Commission. I don't know that we have to print 1 million copies if we have 700,000, just even getting 700,000 out there or whatever. But to me, it's what does advertising cost? I mean, if we're going to start putting up billboards or putting things in the paper or on TV, what does that cost? The cost be incredible. But we need to get the information out there, and I think this is one vehicle.
So I guess my question is, how many hits can we determine how many hits we got on our website to figure out exactly what number of hunters are?
Yeah, we do have that analytics. Sure. I don't know if Lori's here. Yeah, we can provide you the updated hits on that.
Because in the day of the cell phone, and I have it on my cell phone. All I do is I bring it up, punch it up, tell me exactly everything, and I scroll through it. I don't need the big digest. In the day of the mini digest, when it was this size, I carried it in my license with me. That big digest, I don't even read. It's just toilet paper at that point in the game.
I don't think a lot of
Toilet paper.
Yeah. I mean, it's reading material. It's reading material in the.
I gotta admit, I'm still one of these people that actually read the newspaper. So
yeah,
but
yeah.
I don't think a lot of
Most of us today get it online, but.
How many complaints would you say you have?
I would say that personally, and I asked my front desk staff, I said, any call that comes in, let me know, because I want to measure it. I want to take it. I would say I received about 15, and I didn't keep count of them all, but I know we also received a lot of comments coming through saying, thank you, it's about time. And it was more in line with Commissioner Hoover saying, I never read the thing, why did you waste so much money printing it? Right. So I think the two comments from the two commissioners represent what we're wrestling with, because it is a good educational tool. Absolutely, and you want to provide them with, here's your one-step shop for everything related to the Game Commission and the regs. But then as Commissioner Hoover said, how many people weren't even reading it to begin with? And we heard from those who I would just throw it to the side. And, and it sat there, and here we are putting all this money and effort into a product that's not, it's not reaching the audience.
And we're talking about a $500,000 savings when you add income.
Roughly, again,
roughly $500,000 in savings to the commission, and the availability is immediate. It's right there. You can sit in your tree stand and pull it up. If you download it to your device,
right.
you can have it in your device the whole time. So
as long as you got your safety belt on.
As long as you have your safety belt on. Yeah, that would be the answer.
That's good, Brian.
But again, we're in a time when we're trying to save as much money as we can and put more money into habitat. And I didn't know that all the states basically don't do it anymore.
It's such an obvious black hole to throw money into. into from when you're looking at it, because you're not getting any return on the investment. This is given for free.
Right.
So every state that we talked to, and that was just our surrounding states. I know anecdotally from hunting out west, I paid $650 for a license and was told good luck, no digest.
No, I got nothing when I was out west.
Yeah.
So I would be on the side of staying the course and trying to get more information out about how to get the information, I guess. I mean, how do we start, maybe, start collecting as we sell licenses, start collecting email addresses from everybody so that we can send updates. Like if you were interested in getting information out there about, tree stand safety, if we started an email database, we could literally get it out there with one touch of a button.
I wonder if the cost of the digest wasn't $6, if it was, say, $1 or $2, enough to cover our expenses, so it would not be a net loss. What would happen there? I wonder if more people would buy it. I think that would give us a good handle on how many people really would read it. I think you're not going to pay money for something unless you're going to read it,
Or the true cost is about 6. We did an analysis
really?
that was on a previous email that I supplied to the
That's what I
board.
said. I saw all these numbers, and now it's 19 cents, now it's $6 a copy.
Because you remember, you print less, so your price per copy goes up. Then you have your shipping, which we did in-house. Then you still got to print your doe tags and those others. So the $6 conservatively covered costs. Now, the only thing
you would have to print doe tags. You wouldn't have to even put them in there. I mean, really.
Well, you have to have available to the hunter so they can
Right,
have the
but
doe tags.
they're available to the hunter whether or not we put the digest
Correct.
out there.
Correct.
You wouldn't have to put them in there.
No.
If that's an extra
Well,
cost.
if they're part of the digest, if everybody gets a digest, they're automatically part of the digest. So the printing cost is absorbed there. But again, that's higher volume, lower price. But the bottom line is with the digest, based on the analysis I got from admin was, Bureau of Administration, was that the $6 is the cost of the, to put it together, to ship it out, and there is some staff time involved in that, so.
I was gonna say staff time.
Right, when you consider the staff time, it's pretty much, the $6, they hit it pretty much on the head, as that is what the cost is. So what you're saving as compared to actual expenses last year, I think was actually somewhere around $188,000, which was the previous year's actual costs, so.
And the other end of that is anyone with a computer and a printer. Printers are $39. Everybody's got a computer and a printer at home. Or access to one. If you don't, you can go to the library. You can print one off for next to nothing. I mean, you can print the entire.
I don't disagree with that at all.
Yeah,
I don't.
Yeah. So the availability of this is there. It's there's absolutely no reason that you can't get a copy of it somewhere. So I think we've done the right thing.
And to Commissioner Mitrick's previous comment, I think he is right on the spot that we can do some more to develop the digest. It's an online, even if it's online or printed or whatever format the board decides to go. It is a bit. I listened to a hunter last weekend. I was at an event, and they said they love the information we used to put at the end about the different species, the management, things like that. So I actually think there is some opportunity, whatever direction the board decides to go with it, to increase the amount of information that it is provided in the digest. Because they do need to see it, they're going to, one way or another, going to get a hold of a copy, whether they go online, whether they purchase it, or whether it's given out. They're going to read it.
When they did not receive that, do we know the issuing agent where they purchased their?
Yes, I would ask, follow up on that, yes. Yep. And I think that was the most unfortunate part, is that, some of the concerns we were hearing was people who weren't getting this.
Yeah.
Did every vendor get them?
They did. They did.
Yeah.
That was at the mercy of the clerk selling the license at that day, if they went through and provided all that they're
I know
supposed
in
to.
my area, they weren't handed out. I didn't see one.
And that's been a problem even with the digest.
Yes.
When we got complaints, and for years I got complaints that one of the stores when I lived in Glen Olden that was selling licenses wasn't handing digests out. And I actually took a case of them over, and they said, well, we didn't get them, and then they went back, and there it was, a case in the back room. So it's just, it's the people you're dealing with.
It is, which is why we always overprinted the number of digests, because we had some issuing agents who an individual came in, bought a license, and said, yeah, give me 4 or 5 copies for camp. So they'd give out extra digests, and we'd be out of digest even, so you're never able to do a one-to-one for licensed sold and number of digests because you're at their mercy.
The only concern that I had, and I addressed that with now living in Oxford, is the Amish community doesn't have access to computers, but they do have access to the library, and that was my point to them, was that you can easily walk into the library and print it off.
Yeah, I had one individual call me and said, I have no way of accessing the internet. I'm not going to print, he was irate. And then he hung up the phone, and 5 seconds later, he emailed GM comments. Yeah. He must not have thought that I would see this individual who said he didn't have access to the internet emailing. Right. So.
And interestingly, you can put it on your iBooks.
You
The
can put it
PDF
in
version,
iBooks,
you
right.
don't need internet. You can access whatever you can.
If you have an iPhone.
Yep.
You can, and I hesitate to say it because I know we've had starts and stops with this over the years, but we are moving forward with development of another app that's going to be an even updated one that will have access to the digest for the next license year. So the amount of ways that we provide for an individual to get the regs is why we took a look at it, and why other states have as well. Right. 20 years ago, it was the digest or nothing. Right. That's certainly not the case anymore.
No. And we have to move forward. I mean, we're in an electronic age, so and it's saving us money, so it's something to really look at. Okay.
Commissioner Layton sent a comment. His opinion was that not to change anything for next year.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
If this catches on, everybody will be texting into the meeting.
Now we're backing up now to wildlife protection.
Yep.
Here we go.
Yeah.
So the next topic on the agenda is a 3-bureau combination on managed dove fields. I gave a very brief presentation at the September Commission meeting in Middle Creek on just some of the background information from other states. From our Bureau's perspective, the Bureau of Wildlife Management, our main evaluation question for it is it a biological concern for dove populations? And the brief answer to that is no. We have really plenty of room to expand harvest on doves without worrying about any negative impacts on that population. So from that standpoint, it's not an issue, but the answer may not be as simple for a couple of the other bureaus. So from Pete and Randy's standpoint, I'll let them take it over.
Sure, and in some discussions with the Southeast region, there are some opportunities potentially in some of the higher agricultural type of areas, Middle Creek, for instance. Sure. So there's several sites that the region has been evaluating, and then some decisions need to be made based on how does that activity get accomplished. And we just heard from the Bureau of Information Education about the cost savings involved with not printing the digest, etc. It will be fairly costly to put in these fields, but there's opportunities out there. There's hundreds and hundreds of acres being share farmed out there. We could probably incorporate that into some sort of leasing agreements, etc., to have them provide the lion's share of the work to be done out there. So we are in that evaluation stage, depending on how things move forward after this, today and in the future. It shouldn't be too hard to see someplace on the landscape that we at least give a shot at this to see what the utilization is, to see what the interest is. And I think over time, in a few years, there very well could be a demand that grows out there with successes, and we can learn a lot as well, throughout that process.
I think we're seeing that. I know I've hunted out of state. I've hunted Delaware and Maryland, and they have managed dove fields down there. A lot of the farmers do it, and the hunting there is just phenomenal when you get into some managed dove fields, and something that I don't think it hurts anything. I think it helps. It gets more people, gets the youth out there, gives them a reason. If you're sitting by a tree hoping a dove comes by, it could be a pretty boring day, but you start giving them activities like that, I think it becomes, more fun. And that's what we're trying to do.
Sure.
Get more fun out there. So to get the youth involved, and there's something we get the youth involved in really quick. So I'm all for it, I'll be honest with you. I think we're behind in every, from what everyone else is doing. So I don't know about everybody else.
I'm on board with it.
Purely from a legal perspective, I think there's something that we probably should consider. Doves, obviously, they're migratory birds. They're protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the taking of those birds are governed by Code of Federal Regulations. Now, interestingly enough, the feds, through the Fish and Wildlife Service, they allow the concept of a managed dove field. Basically by manipulating a standing agricultural crop or a food plot, which is what a managed dove field is. It's permitted for webless migratory birds by the feds. It's prohibited for any type of waterfowl hunting by the feds. Now, our state law can be, and in this particular case, is a little bit more restrictive than the federal law is. And 2308, Section 2308 of Title 34 has to do with prohibited devices and methods, and one of those sections has to do with baiting. Our standing interpretation and our direction to the general public in regards to the manipulation of standing crops is that it's not an accepted or normal agricultural practice, and it's not an accepted habitat management practice. So what 2308 says is that it's unlawful to hunt the use of hay, bait, grain, etc., with those exceptions that I mentioned. Agricultural crop, an accepted agricultural process or method, or an accepted habitat management method. So I guess the concern that I have from purely from a legal perspective, from a recruitment perspective, there's absolutely no issues at all. From a legal perspective, I guess the issue becomes if, based on our state law, if we permit or acknowledge changed positions on a standing food plot or a standing agricultural crop, that is now has been deemed to be an acceptable habitat management method for doves, then how do we ensure that does not cross over and impact additional species? So the concern would be, as our direction has always been, you can plant a food plot or an agricultural crop, and you can leave it standing for food and cover for wildlife, but once you manipulate it, that crosses the line under state law as to a baiting violation. So if we as an agency permit that to occur for doves, then how does it not cross over into additional species where we would have the potential for food plots or crops being manipulated at other times of the year to affect potentially turkeys or deer or bear? And that's just a legal concern that I have that we need to keep in mind if we move forward with the managed dove field.
So my question is, dove typically opens September 1, and the majority of your harvest happens during that first couple of weeks of the season, I guess.
Agreed.
And we don't have anything else going on during that time frame. The turkey's not in, deer's not in. So are we that, or are we gonna, help me out there.
Yeah, well, like I said.
I get what you're saying. If we did this in the middle of November, we started cutting cornfields down or sunflowers down in the middle of, the deer season.
Right.
I get it, but I don't see that being a concern.
It comes down to, I guess, an issue of can we craft regulations that would permit that to be species specific, right? To limit that to doves, which is what we would, I believe we would.
We're going to start seeing signs on the trees, no deer allowed, right?
Yeah. So that is the one issue that we've done some preliminary legal you know, research into that and how regulations could potentially be crafted to eliminate that as a problem, and that's an ongoing process.
Would this be something that would go across the whole state, or just in certain areas to start with, or what?
Statewide.
Statewide.
One of the ways to address some of those concerns would be, say, that any of the manipulation has to occur prior to September 1. And then that way, any of the fields that was manipulated, most of that grain would be burnt out by the end of September when most of the other seasons come in.
Sort of defeats the purpose, though. I mean, when I hunted in Delaware, I mean, they'd mow down a couple rows, and then a week later they'd mow down a couple of rows. It kept the field hot.
Right.
So you'd sort of defeat the purpose doing it that way.
Well, but like you said, the majority of the activity occurs those first couple of weeks.
First couple of weeks, right? And that's when they're not going to leave it up and just give it away. I mean, that's not going to happen. And you're going to get residual birds and whatnot to come in and feed on it, but anybody harvesting animals over those fields, they should get a ticket.
Right.
And then what you see happen in October is the farmers start taking down their corn, which
corn all over
spread them back out all over the place.
Yeah. Corn's back all over the place.
Well, and dove season runs fairly long time, right? I mean, because of some other regulations this year, it might run until November, right?
The majority of it's done in the September
Right, so I think
season.
if we could put a limit on,
you could do it,
on this until the end of September,
right.
I think we could alleviate a lot of those concerns.
And I think everybody'd be happy with that. I mean, because they're switching over and they're going from dove into other species that are available at that point. I'm sure there's still some dove hunting going on.
So we'll continue to take a look at that from a regulation standpoint, if the board's interested in moving forward with that, see how we can get that done.
Another one thought with Middle Creek was, there's evaluation processes already in place for the deer hunt, the goose hunt.
Right.
And we could really kind of test the waters on what we want to do moving forward by having it at a more controlled location like that.
And I know in the southeast region, in some of the game lands up in up in the I guess Lehigh County, there's I know we took a ride through one of the 205, and they had already been managing fields for dove hunting, but they've been leaving the crops up, and you didn't want to be there opening day of dove season was the point, but yeah, I mean I think we should take a look at it.
Absolutely. We kind of have an add-on agenda item here related to doves. If the discussion for managed dove fields is kind of over right now, we can jump into hunting hours for doves. And you want to give a little bit of background on that?
So we have this is another issue where we're more restrictive at the state level than the feds are. It's real common for people to think that the reason we start dove hunting at noon in September is because that's a federal restriction, but that's not the case. That's actually something that's in our state level regulations, and the way our current regulation reads is that morning doves may be hunted from 12 noon to sunset from the first season opening date through the first season closing date. Historically, we've had 3 segments to the dove season, one that more or less encompasses the month of September, so that's that first opening date, first closing date where you have noon to sunset. Then a second segment, which generally covers general small game season, so late October to late November, and then a short segment around the holidays, Christmas and New Year's. The reason that's becoming an issue now is a couple reasons. The Fish and Wildlife Service a few years ago gave us additional 20 additional days to the season, so they needed to be added in somewhere. We've sort of kept that from not being an issue because we had a closed period in early October, so we still had that basically September segment, which is noon to sunset, and then the rest of the season from basically mid-October to late November, and the later segment from half hour before sunrise to sunset. New wrinkle this year is that the feds have approved compensatory days for Sundays for webless migratory game birds, which means we no longer have to count Sundays against ourselves when we count our dove hunting days, which is going to give us an additional 10 to 12 days that we need to put somewhere in the season. And the most logical way to do that is week in early October that we've had closed the last few years is to open that to dove season as well and have the whole first segment run from September 1 all the way to right before firearms deer and still have that late segment around the holidays. The problem if we do that, because of the way our existing regulations are written, with an unbroken season from September through the end of November, that whole 3-month period is the first season segment, and we would have to have a noon opening time through that whole period. So we'd actually, in a strange way, even though we'd be adding days, we'd be taking away opportunity, because in the part of the season that's now all-day hunting would have to become noon to sunset hunting. So we're interested in, Randy and I talked about this a little bit last week, and both of us have been around a while. This is one of those things, there must have been a good reason for implementing it at the time it was implemented, but neither of us knows what it is. There has been some potential issues, I guess, expressed with conflict with early goose season hunters in September. So from that standpoint, perhaps there's a case to be made for keeping something in the regulations that it's for the first 2 weeks of September or the first 3 weeks of September. Biologically, we could actually do away with it completely and it would be a non-issue, but that's just one of those sort of unintended consequence type things that has come up, and we'd like to have the board consider a way to address that.
Yeah, I personally wouldn't see the need to keep it at noon. I mean, I don't know what, like I said, I thought it was in the federal regulations was the reason that we were doing it. If it's not something that's going to affect the length of the season because we're going to harvest more or something like that, then I mean, in my opinion, I don't know. Doesn't matter to me. We could do away with it.
I think the noontime start predates the early goose season here in Pennsylvania. Right. So yeah, we're kind of having a hard time putting our finger on the exact reason that the 12 noon start.
The only thing that I've ever heard is that one time they were worried about disturbing farmers early around.
Been around as long as I have.
But I don't know if that's really accurate anymore.
Yeah.
I have heard, and one thing I have heard in some of the southern states that have Sunday hunting, they have a noon opener because they don't want to disturb people going to church on Sundays.
Yeah.
Of course, that's not an issue.
We don't have that issue. So, I for one would be okay with doing away with the regulation.
So yeah, it would just be striking the language related to dope in 141.4 to the starting hour at noon, and if we had some unanticipated consequence as a result of that, we could always revisit it, and we could, change the starting hour in the future. So,
good. Very good.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ian. So the next item on the agenda is, I believe, from Commissioner Layton to evaluate the process to exempt people who purchase pheasants and release on private property from needing a pheasant permit. So pheasant permit obviously is a new issue, a new regulatory issue, and there was an exemption put in place for youth hunters at the time that permit was approved by the board. So, I mean, additional exemptions for other folks can certainly be considered. Right now, the youth would not need the permit, and also people on regulated hunting grounds and with certain special dog training permits who are generally not required to have a hunting license anyway are exempt from the pheasant permit. So I guess there was feedback from the public about maybe some sportsmen's clubs that purchase pheasants for their own, for special youth hunts on their own properties and that type of thing, where the youth wouldn't necessarily need to have the pheasant permit, but the sports clubs, the adults who would perhaps be running a dog, etc., for those youth would have to have the pheasant permit when they were actually purchasing the pheasants on their own from a lawful propagator, releasing them on their own property for the hunt. So they can certainly do that. Our regulations allow the release of pheasants, propagated, lawfully acquired propagated pheasants for dog training and hunting purposes. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as they take those birds in accordance with the established seasons and bag limits that the board, has in place every year. So one thing that we could do, our recommendation, is to exempt persons who purchase their own birds, lawfully acquired propagated birds, pheasants, on private property that's not stocked by the Game Commission. We could probably draft a regulation that would exempt those folks. And I'm not sure how many complaints that we had on that, or how many folks were affected by that, but that's certainly one thing
Would
we
that
could take a look
include
at.
people who hunt with them, or would those people have to have a license?
No,
Or
they would.
a pheasant permit?
It would include those that hunt with them.
It wouldn't, I thought we already had that in the regulations where they could just apply for that regulated shooting permit.
Could, but there's a lot of restrictions on what they need. It's not as easy. They have to have so many acres and,
Right.
so.
The only concern that I would have would be, you're gonna have farms next to the game lands that we're stocking, and you're gonna have guys saying, I put birds out, when in fact they're shooting birds stocked by the Game Commission.
Right, and they would,
I would be really concerned with that.
right, if they acquire them from a lawful propagator, then there's different methods that propagator has to comply with in order to sell those birds to those hunters. They have to mark them, or at least at the very minimum, give them a receipt. So if hunters are out there without a pheasant permit and they're adjacent to a game lands, they better be either having birds that are marked, releasing birds that are tagged, which we could probably put that into the regulation that the bird has to be tagged in order to be exempt from the pheasant permit. Or they would have to have a receipt or a toe clipped on the bird, which is another authorized way of marking for the propagator to mark the bird. So, I mean, the statutory permits that we have in place that currently exempt people from the pheasant permit, they have to release banded birds. The statute requires that they release banded birds, and there's actually a penalty built in to those sections, those permit sections, that says if you shoot a bird that is not tagged, you have to report it to your local conservation officer, and there's a $50 fee associated with that. So, there may be a way that we can exempt folks on their own properties purchasing their own birds from a permit, provided that they're tagged. And I mean, that would be,
That would also take care of the club that raises their own birds.
Well, could we not create a permit for that instead of having a like a shooting permit, like for a gun club or something like that does stock it? Could we not create a permit that would be
Create another class of permit.
or another class of permit, right? Instead of a propagator or something like that, that would exempt that farm or property.
Release permit or something along
Yeah.
those lines.
Yeah.
It could be done.
I would be for keeping it as simple as possible, In other words, the
Yeah.
person that sells you the birds gives you, in addition to a receipt, like 25 tags for each bird at your harvest, and rather than having these birds have to be banded and all that kind of thing, just make it real easy. And, not worry about if they shoot one of the Game Commission birds. I mean, that gets a little...
Well, that would be an issue in that if we exempt the farm next to where we're stocking.
Well, if they're going to release 25 birds, and they've got 25 tags, then,
Right.
if those birds could just as easily go onto the Game Commission thing. So
Right.
I think it's
I just don't want to give them an end run.
no loss.
I think you're open can of worms there,
As long as
At
they've
least
got a
tag
receipt that they've bought 25 birds, they got 25 tags, whatever. Just make it easy.
So we can take a look at if you're interested in pursuing some type of a permit for that.
Yeah, I think
As
a
opposed
permit-
to a blanket
Permit would be
exemption.
better than a blanket exemption.
We might want to prepare some options for review.
So number 2, next on the agenda is Title 75 authority for our officers, and that our
Randy,
officers, I'm
can
sorry.
I spent almost an hour the other night trying to figure out what Title 75 is. Could you just
Okay.
briefly summarize that
Sure,
so I might have a
absolutely.
clear understanding? Because I really dug into
Okay.
it and I was really confused.
Not a problem. Title 75 is the vehicle code in Pennsylvania. So it's everything to do with traffic and traffic control. And so it's your typical police, municipal and state police activities out there on the road every day, traffic issues. That's what Title 75 is. Right now, this is strictly a statutory issue. Our officer's authority is spelled out in the Game and Wildlife Code in Title 34, Section 901. And basically what it says is that our officers have the authority to do game and fish and boats and forestry and parks and environmental matters. In addition to that, if they're acting within the scope of their employment, they also have full Title 18 authority. Title 18 is the crimes code, so they can do any aspect of Title 18, from a summary violation all the way up to a felony. In addition to that, they also have the authority to do any other offense that's found in Pennsylvania law that is classified as a misdemeanor or a felony. So that would include Title 75, the vehicle code, only at the misdemeanor and felony level, however. It does not include summary violations, which would be the vast majority of your traffic infractions that occur out there would be Title 75 summary violations. So this is just clearly a legislative issue that we would have to approach the legislature about if they wanted us to have full Title 75 authority, including traffic summaries. And this was also, I believe, Commissioner Layton's topic for discussion.
It's Fish and Boat, don't they have Title 75 on their lands?
They do. The Fish and Boat Commission has full Title 75 authority on their property. They own a limited amount of property, obviously, compared to our 1.5 million acres of state game lands. But so I'm not sure what Commissioner Layton wanted to discuss here on this particular topic, but it is a legislative issue. Have to be granted by the general.
Is it already in a bill? Is that already in bill form? It's not.
It has been in the past. Representative Hanna has introduced it like the last 4 sessions, but it just doesn't move.
Well, my concern right now, we cut our training budget by 75%. If you're going to pursue this, aren't you going to add some really significant numbers to
retrain them in this?
Yes, it would add some additional time at the academy, because if you expand into those minor traffic type violations, it's a bulk of Title 75, where right now the misdemeanors and felonies are pretty limited. And we do train in that, but to train the entire code is going to take more time in initial training, and probably be some required in-service training as much as Title 75 changes, and even just to do update training. So yes, it would increase training.
And how would that impact your deputies?
It wouldn't, because deputies don't have any of the police powers.
Right. The authorities that I spelled out there, our deputy force is limited to those game, boat, fish, parks, forestry type of enforcement. They do not have the Title 18 Crimes Code authority, nor the any other misdemeanor or felony. So there would be a significant training component that would be involved, and that issue would once they would be trained up, then there would be additional court time. I mean, WCO does a traffic stop. They live in their vehicles. They do. I mean, and they do a traffic stop out on the interstate, and they find drugs or something in the vehicle, and it's going to take away from their natural resource-oriented law enforcement efforts.
Now, are you going to be able? No, this is a question. Right, somebody has a tail light out, a broken tail light. Are we just going to stop them for a broken tail light, or are you stopping them for a violation, a game violation, and then you find a tail light and say, well, all right, I already got you for a violation. You know what? instead of, we're halt the game here, I think, you know.
Well, some of the
Not
argument
running
that's pro
vehicle.
for this legislation is that if they had the ability to stop for the tail light or something like that, it would give them some more opportunity to stop folks for game law violations that they don't have evidence of at the time.
So somebody spotlighting with a tail light out gives you permission to
If they were
stop the
in legal
vehicle.
spotlighting
Right,
hours,
right,
or,
right.
you know, they suspected them of road hunting where they really didn't have enough reasonable suspicion to stop
Right.
them, that if they had a tail light out or something, they still could do that.
So I guess the question is, do we spend any capital on this if we don't think it's going to get put through anyway?
I doubt there's a lot of support for it in the legislature.
I would tend to agree with that. I mean, just,
Now,
One of the ways we've worked around it now on our own property, though, is, for example, there's a game lands regulation that makes it unlawful to operate an unregistered vehicle on the game lands.
Right.
So it's not really, you're not using Title 75, you're using
Right.
your game lands
Right, right.
regulation. So, I mean, we do have some ways on our own lands that we've worked around it. And that also allows the deputies to enforce it on our game lands if it's necessary.
I think if we were going to approach it, that if we approached it similar to what Fish has, even though we have more property, you know, that if we approach the legislature and ask them to give us the authority just on our own property, that might be more palatable than statewide authority.
I would agree with that.
All right, well, I guess that's it.
if we were going to approach it,
If we were gonna approach
that
it,
would be a
yeah.
good start.
I think
right?
I'd find out first if we had any opportunity of it passing before we go spending any time on it.
All right, next on the agenda, discuss the current prohibition on semi-automatic shotguns outside of special regulation areas for big game. And that's, you know, as we're all aware, in the special regs areas is the most highly populated area of the state, and where we have the most restrictive, you know, firearms regulations, what can be used, and semi-automatic shotguns for big game have been lawful in those areas for
30 years,
yeah,
or whatever.
for eons, and really, if it was going to be an issue, it would have been an issue by now, and it hasn't been an issue, so there is a regulation, or I'm sorry, there's in the big game hunting chapter, in chapter 23, there's statutory language that prohibits the use of semi-automatic firearms for big game hunting, but that same section also gives the board the authority to promulgate regulations to allow for it to happen. So it's already been done in the special regulations areas. I don't really see any issues with allowing it in the remainder of the state.
We've been using it coming from the experience side of using semi-automatics for the last however many years, 30 plus years. We've not seen an issue with them. It does give us the opportunity to expand semi-automatics out to the state on a slow, progressive level. Knowing that the experience is there, we understand that, you know, that it doesn't have any issues. And I think it may be a little bit more palatable to everyone, especially, you know, knowing the population is coming up in the northwest, in the north central and northwest, comes from the populated areas as well. They're used to using it, so I'd be all right with it.
They're already allowed for turkey hunting statewide,
correct,
and
yeah.
manually operated shotguns are already allowed for big game statewide, so it's the matter of the semi-automatic action, that's all it is.
Right.
So we could draft regulations for that.
I'm okay with it, yeah. We already did the safety harness side, that's done.
Yes. And number 5. Number 5 is discussing a requirement for all hunters to report their big game harvest within 24 hours and require hunters to receive and write on the tag a validation number, which I guess that's a...
Because it says,
Where is that?
I don't know where it
You went to get a picture taken, I think.
Oh, you're right, you're right.
Yeah,
Postpone it
yeah, we can
till
do,
lunch.
can we do it this afternoon?
Is that
Commissioner
something you can do now? Or?
Yeah, oh yeah, there's plenty, like lunch.
We can do that. I don't want to extend this afternoon stuff out too far, but get out of here.
We could go on to,
You want to do the PGC policy on Windmills?
yes, that'd be good.
Can we do that? We have somebody here for it.
Yeah, it's where Pete's here.
Pete? Peter? You've been summoned.
All right. You're welcome.
We're going to discuss windmills.
Right.
Yeah, come on up. Yeah, we're just jumping around today. You know?
You gotta be fluid, Pete, you gotta be fluid.
Yeah, I think they called me.
Oh. Why didn't you tell me that before I got up here?
I didn't know that.
But notice when she comes up.
You can come up. You can join
I
me.
thought you were talking about,
I'd rather you do this report, actually.
you were talking about the other thing. It did affect me, maybe. Okay, great.
See, that's what happens when you turn your back on the current discussion. You miss half of it.
So back in 2005, 2006, there was, this dramatic push across the state to increase alternative forms of energy. And so this was drafted by then Chief of the Division of Environmental Planning and Habitat Protection Division, Bill Kapulias. And so that was then. And things have changed pretty dramatically across the landscape over the last few years. Since that time, we've had 19 different, attempts at gaining access to state game lands, and these have ranged from, I believe they were in every region other than the Northwest region. And at no point in those 19 attempts did anybody successfully secure access to put windmills on state game lands. Bring us to just a few months ago, met with some folks from the Northeast that had some interest in putting windmills on Game Lands 300. Put out a natural resource recovery questionnaire to try to determine whether or not there was some feasibility to put a site on state game lands. And once again, we ended with the same basic result of no interest from the agency side in having these windmill sites on state game lands. So we went out, we met with a local representative and senator, as well as a former representative, and had another discussion about this, and some of the discussion ended up with, why don't you just put out a policy decision that you're not going to allow windmills on state game lands. You haven't allowed them in 19 attempts, you're not really interested in them because of the fragmentation of habitats, etc. So why don't you do something a little differently? Because they felt that we were dangling the carrot out. If you keep jumping higher and going a little further, eventually your attempt is going to be successful. And it'd be odd at this point to say that there would be any chance of success on state game lands, or at least from the perspective of staff time. So we've put together a basic draft for everybody to take a quick look at, and basically highlight some of the issues on state game lands, why we don't see them as compatible for, an activity that we would allow on state game lands. That's kind of where we are today. And it's the same version that you guys have forwarded.
This one is the proposed.
And basically highlighted in the third paragraph down there is due to incompatibility, the commission will no longer support or otherwise encourage the wind energy developers to pursue state game lands as potential sites for wind energy development. Each of these sites is several acres in size. The latest one up on Game Lands 300 was going to impact hundreds of acres up there. And generally, the sites that they're looking at are some of our higher quality, rarest types and uniquest habitats we have on state game lands. And, you know, this site has been burned. It's been slated to receive much more burning in the future. We're managing it. It's got an incredible population of snowshoe hares and rare moths and warblers. And, it's a pretty interesting site. But those seem to be the types of sites that they typically gravitate towards. You know, the sites that don't grow up in the trees that, you know, grow like this, but they grow up into hundreds of acres of scrub oak. So that's why we're here today.
You know, myself, I see those. Going up to Columbia County, we run up and go through Frackville and hit that string of mountains with 100 of them across the top of that mountain. And it's just disheartening to see, you know, this big chunk thing sticking up in the middle of the woods. And I don't know that other than killing bats and birds that we hear about all the time, finding them at the base of these things, I wouldn't want them on there.
Right, the fragmentation of the landscape,
right.
You know, the incompatibility with trying to hunt those places.
Sure.
I could imagine trying to call in a turkey and right underneath one of those windmills, even a white one.
Right.
Probably wouldn't come in.
Wow, nice.
Oh, it's every day.
I agree, and I don't know you're going to get any complaints from any of the commissioners on that. I think just make the point that we're not going to do it and tell them to stop asking.
Right, right.
I agree.
I live with them. I'm not very enthused about it.
But it destroys the landscape. I mean,
Well, that's the thing. Beyond the impacts, the direct impact to the individual bird or bat, it's the more dramatic fragmentation of habitats that we're concerned about.
Well, and they're very protective of the site where it's at.
Oh, yeah.
So you're not going to get in there to wander around. You could, at least, I don't know what the proposal is, but you're taking that out of hunting.
Right, and there's, I mean, lifetimes of impact there.
Right.
You know, these aren't a 5-year, we're going to reclaim it, move away from it, and then sporadically tend it with a, you know, a truck or something. These require, you know, that everyday level of activity, which would certainly make that land not huntable, or not at the quality that it is today.
Right. Yeah, that's not something we're really interested in. I agree.
Okay, so we'll move forward, I guess,
Yep.
and add this to the
Yep.
January agenda.
Yes.
Who was the end of this license sale?
Doc.
Doc.
You want to do it after lunch? Do that?
We can do that. I guess we can do that after lunch.
So we'll break for lunch.
We'll break for lunch. Okay, we're going to break for lunch, and we'll be back at, what, 1 o'clock? Turn your mic.
Yeah, go right. I just thought,